Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're plunging into, well, one of the great paradoxes, really, of the post-Cold War world, this moment of supposed global triumph,
Yeah.
peace, democracy spreading. But instead, it somehow became this long road back to geopolitical conflict. Okay, let's unpack this.
Right. So our mission today is to dig into a whole stack of sources, looking at U.S. foreign policy basically from the early 90s right up to now. We're tracing this specific argument that key Western decisions early on, things like the push for unipolarity, broken promises on NATO, how Russia's economy was handled, didn't just cause problems later. The argument is they actually, set the stage for the crises we're seeing now, especially in Eastern Europe.
And the core idea coming out of this material, it's pretty stark, isn't it? It basically says the U.S. saw itself immediately as the single global hegemon, and then built its whole foreign policy around stopping anyone else from rising up. And that involved, well, some pretty controversial stuff, like funding what some call electoral revolutions, or even, and this is quite shocking, tacitly backing extremist groups if it helped short-term goals.
Yeah, to really get this, you have to go back to the beginning.
Hmm.
The 1992 Defense Planning Guidance, the DPG-92. This wasn't about partnership. It laid out a doctrine of primacy. Keep U.S. dominance, full stop. Prevent any rivals. And the sources are specific. They named names: Russia, China, Germany, Japan. Any potential challenger needed to be kept in check.
It really sounds like they were saying the quiet part out loud. Stability wasn't the main goal, was it? It was unilateral power. I mean, Charles Krauthammer's quote really jumps out. The U.S. should go all the way, aim for universal domination, and exploit it. That's pretty blunt language.
Extremely blunt. And it really did define things. The first big flashpoint, NATO expansion. You had to put yourself back in February 1990. German reunification is on the table. And the sources confirm James Baker, then Secretary of State, promised Gorbachev not once but 6 times that if the Soviets let a unified Germany join NATO, the alliance's jurisdiction would not shift 1 inch to the east.
1 inch. And Gorbachev agreed to arguably the biggest strategic shift of the late 20th century based on that. Just a verbal promise.
Apparently so. And the sources say Gorbachev later felt completely trapped. He realized those promises weren't written down, not in any treaty.
Wow. So that sense of betrayal, that feeling inside Russia that this whole new order was maybe untrustworthy, it started right there.
It seems so. And then, boom, the Soviet Union collapses.
Yeah.
Suddenly, NATO, this defensive alliance, doesn't have its main adversary.
Yeah.
So it needed a new reason to exist, right? A new raison d'etre. And the sources argue that the interventions in the Balkans, particularly the bombing campaigns against the Serbs in Yugoslavia, who were allied with Russia, well, that served a purpose. It helped preserve NATO. It gave it these new missions, intervening in civil wars, things outside its original Article V mandate.
So it morphed from defense to intervention. Some critics would say a kind of moral enforcer, maybe.
Yeah.
And this is where some of the diplomacy starts to look, well, cynical, according to these sources. Like Henry Kissinger's take on the Rambouillet text in '99. He called that agreement demanded of Serbia a provocation, an excuse to start bombing.
That's a really crucial point, because that text, it demanded Serbia allow NATO troops across all of Yugoslavia. And get this, those troops would have total legal immunity from everything.
Immunity, wow.
Yeah, so outrageous. Kissinger and others argued that it seemed designed to be rejected.
So rejection gives you the justification you needed for the bombing campaign.
That's the argument presented in the sources.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting and dark. How does this connect back to what was happening inside Russia? If you're aiming for global dominance and Russia's a named potential rival, how did things play out internally to keep them weakened?
Well, the main mechanism, according to these sources, was the economic shock therapy.
Yeah.
We hear that term a lot, but the sources really detail the failure. There was apparently sound advice on the table from Russian economists like Larisa Piasheva. She said, look, auction state property first, soak up all those rubles, fight inflation that way. But that advice was ignored.
Okay, wait, so let me get this straight. Instead of selling off state assets in an orderly way first, they just freed prices overnight in an economy where almost no one outside the old system knew how to operate.
Exactly. And the immediate result, hyperinflation. People's life savings, gone, just like that. And because the big state companies hadn't been privatized yet, who was positioned to grab them for pennies on the dollar?
The old guard. The nomenclature.
Precisely. The well-connected communist officials, they snapped up massive industries for next to nothing. It created instant, massive inequality. Capital just fled the country.
And the sources frame this not just as, like, a terrible policy mistake, but as sabotage, that many Russians came to believe it was actually a deliberate plan to cripple Russia as a power.
That's the strong sentiment reflected in the sources, yes, that it felt like a conscious design, and the political fallout was huge and long-lasting.
How so?
Well, for ordinary Russians, what did democracy now mean? It meant chaos, poverty, national humiliation. The sources say the word itself became toxic, like a curse word, which, created the opening for someone promising order, strength, national dignity.
While Russia's dealing with that internal chaos, U.S. foreign policy seems to have had this flexible approach to conflict, maybe even hypocritical. The material says the U.S. and CIA were tacitly backing separatist fighters in Chechnya, including groups linked to bin Laden, working with the Saudis.
That's what the sources assert, yes. Aligning with Saudi Arabia to support these groups.
Using groups we'd later call terrorists for short-term gain against Russia.
The sources, quote, planners at the time, basically saying, look, this kind of thing, even terrorism, is sometimes a small price to pay for being a superpower.
Wow, that calculus really shows the priority, doesn't it? Keeping Russia weak, keeping it unstable on its borders.
That seems to be the strategic logic described.
So if economic chaos was one tool, what was the next one? These sources talk about electoral revolutions.
Right. The 2000s saw this rise of color revolutions, often in countries right next door to Russia. And they were heavily backed, the sources say, by U.S. government-funded NGOs. The National Endowment for Democracy, NFIRI, George Soros' Open Society Foundation.
Any specific examples?
Slovakia in '99 is highlighted. So something like $850,000 in foreign money allegedly went to opposition groups. The idea was to, push voters towards the right guy.
Which leads us straight to Ukraine and the Maidan events in 2014. That seems like a critical moment in this narrative.
Absolutely. The sources claim key figures and groups involved in the Maidan protests received funding from U.S. aid and Soros-linked organizations. And when the Ukrainian government tried to crack down, you had U.S. officials like Victoria Nuland saying very publicly that this was absolutely impermissible in the European state.
But the sources also point out something crucial, right? That Western policy seemed to ignore the deep existing divisions within Ukraine.
Yes, exactly. Ukraine wasn't monolithic. Historically, ethnically, it was very divided. The sources talk about 3 Ukraines. And after Maidan, the way the government was ousted is described in the sources as unconstitutional. There was even an unconstitutional third round of voting held later.
And didn't the sources mention internal U.S. concerns, too? About Vice President Biden's diplomacy and his son's position at Burisma?
Yes, there were notes from State Department officials expressing concern about that potential conflict of interest, or at least the appearance of one.
And then there's the really dark side of Maidan, the role of extremist groups on the ground.
The sources are quite detailed here. They talk about the significant role played by violent radical right groups, neo-Nazi-affiliated groups even.
Right sector. And Svoboda's militia, C-14.
Exactly. And C-14, just for context, the name apparently comes from David Lane's white supremacist 14-word slogan. So we're talking about genuinely extreme elements involved in the physical overthrow.
Which connects to that chilling mystery about the snipers.
Ah, yes. The Estonian foreign minister, Urmas Paet, reported a conversation he had. He spoke with a doctor on the Maidan Square, Olga Bogomolets, and she apparently believed the same snipers.
The same ones.
Yes, the same professional snipers were shooting people on both sides, police and protesters.
To what end? Just maximum chaos.
That was the suspicion reported, a deliberate tactic to escalate things beyond any point of negotiation or return.
Wow, that kind of alleged cynicism aiming for chaos itself. It feels like that pushes us right into this idea of a new Cold War. And the sources keep coming back to these red lines that Russia stated, but the U.S. seemingly ignored.
The big one, repeatedly cited, is the 2008 NATO summit in Bucharest. That declaration explicitly promised future NATO membership for Georgia and Ukraine. For Russia, that was described as crossing a bright red line, an existential threat.
And it wasn't just theoretical, was it? The Georgia War happened later that same year.
Right. And the sources argued Georgia felt emboldened by U.S. support, by weapons sales. They claim Georgia actually started that war. Ambassador Richard Miles, former U.S. ambassador, apparently admitted later that Georgia's president, Saakashvili, likely wouldn't have attacked without those offensive weapons the U.S. provided.
So a history of ignoring warnings, escalating tensions, yet even right before the 2022 invasion, there was a diplomatic effort, wasn't there?
Russia put forward draft treaties in December 2021. They laid out demands: stop NATO expansion, return to INF-style missile limits, pull back military deployments in Eastern Europe.
And the U.S. response?
Dismissal, essentially. The sources quote a White House perspective that Russia was just Performing diplomacy, not actually undertaking diplomacy. Basically, not serious.
Even though Putin had apparently warned Bush way back in 2008, what was that warning?
The sources say Putin told Bush privately that if Ukraine ever joined NATO, it would likely fall apart. That Russia would end up with Crimea and the eastern regions. A very direct warning years earlier.
So when the invasion did happen, the U.S. response, according to these sources, fit a pattern.
It was consistent, the sources argue, with a strategy that actually favored a long insurgency, what some call the Afghan model.
The goal being to bleed Russia.
To bleed Putin, yes.
Yeah.
Former CIA Director Leon Panetta was very explicit about the proxy war aim. Kill Russians. That's a direct quote highlighted.
And the conflict escalated even further. Nord Stream 2 destruction comes up.
It does, and the sources place it in the context of earlier public threats. Both Victoria Nuland and President Biden had said before the invasion that if Russia moved in, they would bring an end to Nord Stream 2.
So the suggestion is, given the context, it wasn't an entirely unexpected development in the conflict.
That's how the sources frame it, yes, as fitting within the established policy trajectory.
So looking back at everything we've covered from these sources, it really paints a picture of a cycle, doesn't it? This relentless pursuit of unipolar dominance after the Cold War. It led policymakers, the argument goes, to ignore warnings, break promises, and the result was this huge geopolitical blowback, the conflict we're living through now.
There's one anecdote in the sources that really crystallizes the failure of strategic empathy, maybe. A civilian advisor at the Pentagon apparently asked senior staff a simple question. How would the U.S. feel if, say, Mexico invited China to build military bases on its territory?
And the answer?
Immediate and unanimous, according to the source.
War. Wow.
And that exercise, the sources say, finally made some of those officials realize, maybe too late, how Russia perceived NATO moving right up to its borders in Ukraine.
It really does raise a crucial question for us now, doesn't it? You mentioned Zbigniew Brzezinski earlier, and his point about Ukraine needing significant national unanimity before it could join NATO. Because otherwise, he warned, its internal divisions, those three Ukraines the sources mention, would just become something Russia could exploit.
A source of division, yeah.
So considering those deep historical splits and the controversial way the 2014 government change happened, according to these sources, what does this whole ongoing conflict suggest about the dangers, maybe the limits, of trying to push for certain governance models from the outside, especially when that internal unity isn't really there?
That is perhaps the central question arising from this whole period, isn't it? And one that, we all need to keep thinking about.
Indeed. A lot to process there. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.